really. As a father of two young kids, like I want them to grow up and by the time they get to secondary school, I would love it if there was a little more value on creativity and things had changed for the better. And I want to be a part of that change. And, I went through a long time of thinking there's too many things in the world that I want to change. I'm just one person and this is really stressful and overwhelming. And ultimately, I landed on this one cause, which is creativity. And if that's not a valid cause, given that it's a very reason for our survival as a species, then I don't know what is. And that's given me a lot of mental solace to have this one thing to focus on.
Hello and welcome to episode 11. I guess it's season 2, episode 1, or episode 11. But we'll go whichever works for you. But welcome to this episode of How Do You End Up Doing That? My guest on this episode is Ben Tallon, who's an illustrator, hand lettering specialist, author, and podcast host. He's just a multi-talented guy. He's written 2 books now. His first book, Champagne on Wax Crayons, came out about 10 years ago, and his most recent book came out earlier this year, which was The Creative Condition. Ben's such a super interesting guy to talk to. He's got a real passion for creativity and wants to kind of talk about how it impacts every element of our lives, and he's also really passionate that everyone has a creative spark inside them. It's just not something that everyone kind of recognizes. And we go into a lot of talking about that kind of detail of where does creativity come from, how do people find their creativity, creative outlets. Lots of, I feel like I'm using the word creative too many times now, but it really, I don't think, you can get the message across without using it quite that much. So it's such a fascinating chat. Ben's a really interesting guy. I was really chuffed when he agreed to come on the podcast and talk about his process, how he got into becoming an author, what got his career started, and some of his favourite bits of work that he's done over the years. And towards the end, we even go talking a bit of detail about where he wrote one of his books, which might not be where you expect, or maybe it is. Maybe it is when you get there. Who knows? Let me know when you get to the end of the podcast. I recorded this back in, I think it was late March, early April, and it's taken me this long to put it out because as soon as I sat down to start editing it, I noticed that I was recording using the wrong microphone. So the audio quality from my side isn't brilliant. And I'll be honest, every time I thought about editing it, I just got really disheartened about the thought of having to sit and edit my own voice coming through what sounds really a bit like a bathtub speaker. It's not, the audio quality is not great on my side, so massive apologies for that if this is the first time you've listened to one of these podcasts. Normally the audio quality isn't that bad. Normally it sounds more like this that I'm talking right now, which is through the fancy studio microphone rather than the webcam microphone. So apologies in advance about the audio quality. I tried to tweak it and edit it, but it just wasn't working. So I've just reduced the amount that I'm talking down to a minimum and let the conversation with Ben kind of flow as much as possible with him talking, because he's got like a really great outlook on life, and his side of the conversation I feel like carries the whole podcast all the way through. One thing to point out, I guess, would be that in previous episodes I've always edited out or dipped the volume whenever there were any swear words, but for this one it just felt a lot more natural and kind of interrupted the flow if I did try and drop any of the swear words out of it. So I've left them in there, so that's why this episode is marked as expletive or mature. So just bear that in mind if you were listening to this with any kids, I guess, or if you're easily offended by swear words. There is some swearing in the episode, so just bear that in mind. So without any further ado, let's jump into our conversation with Ben. Hope you enjoy. Cheers. Never really a format. I tried writing questions, which is not something I've ever done, and I spent about the best part of 2 hours going, but how do I know that this question is going to lead on to the next question? How do I know that question is like, it's just not, it's not me, it's not the way that I kind of done it ever. So I was like, right, I'm not gonna structure it. I'm gonna keep it exactly how I always do it.
which is there's only two questions which are very formal, which is the very start one, and the very end one.
Yeah, I think with these things you've got to just go with what's natural to you. I mean, I
Yeah,
do I do plan them, but I know what you mean. It does require that kind of responsive creativity to keep it, because you can't, if a story from 5 questions down the line comes up in question
yeah,
one, then you sort of got to move on your feet with it. So like you say, maybe it's better just not to.
yeah. Because I'm sort of like, oh well, I've sort of like so that the first question that I'll go through the written questions that I've got. The first one: tell us a bit about school and your time at school. Did you focus on creative subjects, or did you explore a broad range of topics to see what might fit you? And I was like, okay, that's a good one. Then the second question I was going to ask was, do you think that you were held back by the education system, and do you think that creativity was drummed out of you by formal education? Well, I'm sure that's a great question, but at the same time, the answer to question one might not lead us down that path in any way. So I was like, oh, just sod it. I'll go with the question one, and
Yeah,
and then we'll just kind of pick up the flow as we go. So I'm going to
yeah.
minimise that.
I think in that, I think in that instance, you're probably better just having a list of bullet points of things you want to hit, and then wherever it seems natural.
Yeah. I think it's kind of where I'm going. So yeah, let's kind of kick it off. Tell us a bit about school
Yeah.
and what you sort of what were your subjects? Where did you start? Where did you end? Sort of thing.
Are we talking secondary or just
Yeah,
the whole
secondary.
thing? Hmm.
Yeah,
Well,
I guess
yeah.
for if there's something that you think is relevant from primary, then that'd be good to touch on. But no, if you want to
mm,
start from secondary, that'd be good.
No, yeah, secondary's good. I was at a standard state school in Keighley, where I'm from in West Yorkshire, and it was I think it's quite a big school. Looking at now as a parent, my kids we just found out today they've got into the primary school that we wanted them to get into. And I'll admit, a lot of the kind of boxes I wanted to check for that were not what a lot of other parents seem to worry about. So I don't give a monkeys about Ofsted. It's like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want bottom rung rating, because then you kind of got to go, okay, what's going on? But I very much take from my own experiences in secondary school when I'm considering what I think is going to be right for my kids, and a big
Mm-hmm.
part of that is the social side of things. So we are in Salisbury, which is very white, very middle class.
Okay.
We only moved here a couple of years ago, so right away I've got my eye on, how do I compensate for that and make sure they're exposed to people from all different backgrounds, because I know the value of that.
Yeah.
The diversity in every form is really great for growing as a human being. So that's one thing, and that was something that my school was pretty good for, because we had quite a big South Asian population in Keighley. So that was good. So straight away, you were in with a lot of kids who you might not otherwise meet if you just stuck to your little locality. I mean, academically, it didn't do it for me, for the same reason that I think quite a high percentage of people in our industry would echo, which is it was very kind of standard subject focused. And apart from a couple of hours of PE and art each week, we were sat in classrooms in rows of 5 or 6 studying subjects that really didn't motivate me in any way. So I would be either nodding off or prattling around and, just not achieving my potential. I could have got A's looking back. Didn't have that confidence at the time because I just wasn't motivated. So it makes you feel a little bit stupid.
Do you reckon it was the teachers? The like you say you weren't motivated. Do you think the better teachers could have helped you with that, or was it more the education system in as a whole? The fact that you've got to sit in classrooms. It's very people are gone taken through school to be set up to work in offices and do office jobs and be that kind of grey suit, grey environment, everything grey. The system is lacking, but I guess you get those teachers that can kind of extract the best out of people.
I think it was more systemic because I liked a lot of my teachers. We had a decent amount of both, veteran teachers who were just quite seasoned and were very ruthless, but in a way that if you behaved and sort of worked, they would be very funny and they would have your back. But if you didn't, you would get it. And then there you had younger ones who were quite, they could talk to you about a band that you were into, and suddenly it's like, oh, they knew what the football scores were at the weekend, and it's kind of like, okay, I meet this person on a human level, so I'm going to work harder for them in the classroom all of a sudden. So they were my activation points. It was all about character and individual. I didn't know that as a kid. Of course, you don't. You don't know how to articulate or understand these feelings. But invariably, they were the ones I remembered and the ones that I picked life lessons up from. But I think it was more systemic. I just think it's that thing where a brain like mine, which needs variation and is motivated by the things I'm passionate about, there wasn't the space to explore and find those things at that age. So I was good at, languages. I was good at German, did well there, apart from the Yorkshire accent, which I got, dressed down for a number of times. It's like, no matter, it doesn't matter how many stuff you remember and can say to me, if it's in Yorkshire, no one's going to understand you. But even in art, we were sat around big desks drawing fruit bowls, or very mundane things. That should have been a lesson where we were encouraged to be on our feet and be interacting more and collaborating, all the great things that make art subjects really valuable. So it didn't feel all that dissimilar to the other topics. It was worse in some ways because it was slightly less disciplined, which just let us mess around more. So it was kind of like it just wasn't. It didn't do what art should be doing, really. And so the only ones for me were PE and English. English I really loved and did best in. It was reflected in like my only B in GCSE. It was the highest grade I got. Because and I now realise as I'm in my early 40s that I've always had a writer's mind, and I've always been really strongly drawn to storytelling. Everything I'm passionate about, whether it's sports, art, film, books, always storytelling and character is what really makes me feel alive and makes me feel a part of something. So in English, we had a teacher who did move around the class and did let us shout and collaborate and read and all these things that actually I loved and I felt I could bring some of me to. And it was the same with PE, even though I was very average at all the sports. It was an environment where we actually had that little bit of reciprocation with the teachers and we could talk to them on a more human level, like you did with your friends. So actually, if there'd just been a little bit, and this is one of my big things, it's not that you have to revolutionize the education system, because to a degree it has to be something of a factory, doesn't it? Because you're trying to educate the masses for free, so of course there has to be a uniformity to it. But for me, it's subtle changes. It's giving the teachers a bit more time away from bureaucracy and paperwork. You know, I know a lot of teachers, I've got a lot of friends, some that I interviewed for this book that I've just brought out, and they're up till 9, 10 at night doing paperwork and ticking boxes. That's not conducive to the best interests of the students the next day if that teacher's knackered and stressed and coming in and they've got to worry about all that paperwork. They should have the time to use the freedom that they do actually have to plan the lessons as they see fit. That's something that all teachers have, I've come to learn through this research. But it's just that they're weighed down. The demands on their time come from things that are not in the best interest of the students. So for me, it's subtle changes. It's about acknowledging that not all students have a brain where they can sit down and focus for 40 minutes. So why not give them the opportunity to pace around? Why not try to find an arrangement that works for both the kids who do want to sit down and stare at the board or listen? Nothing wrong with that. But the other ones who might be more artistically inclined should have more access to drama and dance and offset that energy a little bit more. It's about respecting those art subjects in a way that nobody looks at maths and goes, well, you're all, the kids who are not going to be accountants or bankers have failed. Nobody looks at it like that. It's a life skill, you know. Fair enough for the ones who do want to go on and actually use maths in their day-to-day job. That's amazing and should be valued. But the same should apply to the arts. It's about teaching kids how to collaborate and express themselves and things like tolerance, the intangibles. It's not about saying they're all going to be artists or dancers or actors. It's about looking at a broader education system so that the kids can turn up at a maths lesson and they've got some physical energy out or they've thought about something in a different way, so that then when they do have to sit down in that class, they're more inclined to work hard, and the results do reflect that if you look at any studies around this stuff. So to take it back to your original question, that's exactly how I felt. I had mischievous energy. I was a bit of a lad. I loved a joke. None of my lessons really, apart from English and PE, enabled that, and I just think that's still a problem to this day.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that the sort of, I mean, a couple of things there was, you say art was less, you were less inclined to do that because, obviously you became a commercial illustrator, you're very successful at that role. So to sort of think, that immediately in school that someone with your talent and ability and kind of creativity to not enjoy art, that's, it's not, I mean, it is, I don't want to say a failure of the school, but it's a failure of the system there that they weren't encouraging that thing. And I remember speaking to someone before. He was loved drawing. Was like, I'd never do any kind of art degree or any kind of thing. And I was like, oh, why not? Like, he created it. And he was like, oh no, because if they say you've got to draw that fruit bowl, I don't want to draw a fruit bowl. I want to draw like a logo, or I want to draw this, I want to draw. I don't want to do that. I want to do what I want to do. I don't want to do what you're marking for me to do. So yeah, it's kind of it's interesting. It's something that I've heard before. But the other thing you said about the like maths being like introducing creativity into that. I did a project with Welsh government about 7 years, yeah, because it was when Carol was pregnant. 7 years ago, called Lead Creative Schools, and we went out to school. We went to a school in Aberdare, historically quite a deprived area. Lots of unemployment, lots of this sort of school avoidance, people not turning up to school. And we got funded by Welsh government to go in and do this project where we were paid as consultants to work with kids and introduce creativity into their learning. And it wasn't draw a pretty picture; it was how do you work together to achieve this project at the end. And it was a bit skewed because they were like, oh, we want to make an app. Like that was they went to the kids and said, what do you want to do? And there were 6-year-old kids, and they were like, we want to make an app. We were like, okay, great. So we pitched on the project, went in, and we're like, kids, you're not going to make an app because that's like a bit too hard for 6-year-old kids. But what we can do is show you how to make like this promo, like, sort of pitch, sort of like Dragon's Den style thing where you can sort of work together, come up with this idea, and then you can pitch it to the rest of the school, go up on stage. And they loved it, absolutely loved it. And there were 2 classes we worked with. And the one class, the teacher was well behind it. She was sort of like fully involved. Yeah, this is great. Getting the kids up, getting them dancing. We were going out in the computer lab. We were running around in the yard. We were doing all this stuff with them. And then the other class, the teacher was like, can you just do it? Because I've got to do my marking. And it was like, all right. Just no, the teacher wasn't getting involved in that. And I think there's, you kind of need those, the creative skills within the school, but also the teachers to kind of lead the charge with that, and the teachers to be engaged and the teachers to be involved. And yeah, I think that's a kind of like a mindset shift for the teachers there that needs to happen, is that they also need to be getting involved and kind of drumming up this enthusiasm, which is hard when you've got marking and paperwork and all this other stuff to do.
That's the problem, yeah. So, I interviewed a friend of mine who I lived with at the time in London called Tom Brooks, and he was a primary school teacher in Greenwich. Really good school, really arts focused. They fought hard to tick all the curriculum boxes, but just do it in a way. This is primary level, but they energized the kids and catered for different backgrounds. And Tom had, for the longest time, he had a great long leash to implement methods. There's a story that I've used in the book, and it's about he had to teach Macbeth, and he recognized that on the face of it, Macbeth wasn't going to appeal to kids from lower income families, or particularly kids who might be mixed race or from black backgrounds who it's Shakespeare, it's very antiquated, so you can understand why he worried that a large percentage of his class were from those backgrounds. So he had to think creatively, and he ended up teaching it in the form of a murder mystery. So he got them all. He got them all on their feet. He divided them all into teams with kids who weren't in their usual friendship circles, and they're excited because it's something different and something as simple as getting them on their feet. And he had big marker pens and dry wipe, sheets, and got them workings out. Someone was a detective. Some of the quieter kids could take more of a back seat and lean on the louder kids. Just an amazing, simple way of getting that lesson across. But it was so successful that those kids didn't even know they'd done the literacy lesson later that day. They were asking when it was, and he's like, well, you've done it. That was it. That wasn't just, but they thought that was just like a leisure session. And it's like, if it felt that good to them, but they're still learning the curriculum, then we need to be doubling down on focusing on that and get rid of all the. But he ended up leaving the education system and moving abroad and teaching privately because he was just so disillusioned. He was only like 25 at the time, and he was really punching above his weight in terms of where he was on the teacher ladder. But just all them kids loved him, and he was their mate teacher. You've always got that teacher you see as more of a mate, but what he got from them was such hard work and such energy and willingness and curiosity and all those beautiful things that you want to see in kids. And it's just a real shame that that's not valued. And like you say, it has to be systemic. It might be a slightly sideways sort of analogy for it, or a story to liken it to, but I'm always talking about, I'm a big Leeds United fan, and I'm always talking about what Marcelo Bielsa did when he came to Leeds. Took over as the on-pitch football manager, but his role, he wanted to revolutionise the entire club. So he implemented his values at every bit of the club's hierarchy. So from the people who worked in the canteen, the ground staff, you know, even work experience students, everybody knew what he wanted and everyone respected each other from the top down and all worked for each other. And that goes back to what you said there about the teachers have to be a part of this. You can't just bring in some cool initiative and go, well, that's a jolly for a day that frees me up to go and mark some papers.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you're missing the point. If you can get that kind of energy throughout the school, everybody's going to win.
Yeah, for sure. Because the thing that happened at the end of that project with the older kid, with the sort of the kids with the teacher who was really engaged, she was like, "Did they learn any?" We were supposed to be helping them teach maths, and she was like, "Did they learn any more maths? I'm not sure. You know, they'll pick it up though. They're six. They're going to pick up like maths." What we did notice was that the kids didn't like. We had full attendance every single Monday for the 12 weeks you were in the school. The kids turned up every single Monday because they were getting involved. They were doing more interesting stuff. They were engaged with learning and engaged with the lessons, and their behaviour was better going forward. But again, with we're dealing with younger kids. It gets harder as you get older because there's so much more social influence as you get into sort of like your teenage years. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's easy. I think capturing kids when you're younger is definitely something that's really going to help.
Yeah, and but every level, it's it doesn't go away the fact that if they're engaged and they feel a part of something, that's very evolutionary and very tribal, and we've had that throughout human history.
Yeah,
So if you can implement that within education and people feel a part of something, of course they're going to show up and give a bit more. It's really that's why the art subjects can't be seen or shouldn't be seen as something that's just hobbying or something on the side. It's like no.
yeah,
Actually, look at the way the time and time again studies have shown that literacy, numeracy, all these things go up when the kids are exposed to just a couple of hours of dance or drama or something along those lines within that same week. And it's a no-brainer because we all need that balance, you know. It's just, you know, I could go on all day about it, but for me, but for me, this is why I'm doing the work that I'm doing now to try and I really want to help the kids who are in that same boat today because I relied on accidental mentors along the way and chance to even make me aware that there was a creative industry. And I had the support in the home, but my parents didn't know about the creative industry, so I had to kind of stumble my way around school feeling disillusioned before very thankfully a couple of teachers, one of them being a woodwork teacher at the time, he sort of said, look, what you haven't got your work experience sorted yet. And I kept saying no to everything and putting off all these. I just didn't none of it appealed. I was quite stubborn and he said, well, what do you like to do? He was the first person to ask me at like the age of 14, what do you like to do? Well, I like to draw. And he went, all right, well, I'll call the local art college and we'll see if we can get you in there for 2 weeks. And that's what happened. That sat me in the corner of the design studio in the local art college with three other kids who also hadn't found their way. And we got to sample everything, you know, all the different aspects of a foundation course. An amazing 2 weeks. And I fell in love with that place and wanted to go there. But if it wasn't for that person who went out of his way when he didn't have to, I just could have stumbled on disillusioned and ended up getting into bottle like the rest of the mischievous kids. So, you know, that needs to change. It needs to be less about chance and more about giving them the opportunity to find out who they are.
it's interesting you said that because I was going to come on to sort of like leaving school and what were you sort of what were your sort of aspirations? Because I've spoken to a couple of people who they're both Joe Latham, whose book I have right in front of me here. He's a comic book artist, illustrator kind of person, and at school he was he's very much into art. He went to the careers advisor, was like, "What shall I do after I leave school?" They went, "Become an artist." I don't know, go get an art degree. And then the exact same story with another friend of mine, Deborah Price. She now works for Aardman as a production supervisor, working on the sort of the more, the office side of the creative industries rather than the actual illustrative side.
Mm-hmm.
And again, she went to the careers advisor, was like, "I like art." They went, "Well, go to get an art degree, find your niche, try and become an artist." But there's that the creative industries is that's like less than a fraction or percentage of the creative industries is become an artist. There's so many other things you can do there. So yeah, I guess like was it that the thing your sort of careers advice leaving school? What was the sort of the route after you left?
Well, I mean, to be quite honest, I didn't have much of a clue. I got to the end, and um, like I said, I had this experience at art college and really loved the energy in that place far more than school. But because I was an idiot and I did sport because I thought I could play for Leeds United, and I was very poor at football. I had to stay on an extra year to get art GCSE, so I did that, and I did this kind of intermediary business course, which was just to justify my being in the school. Like I couldn't go and do 1 hour a week of art GCSE and then and then toss it off for the rest of it. So anyway, so I did this intermediary business course, which actually did have a few valuable little trinkets that I learned from that. But really, it was about getting that and getting into art college, which is what I did at 17, and just fell in love with the place. And I wouldn't say it lit my passion for like design or art yet. That wasn't until later into uni that I started to really see the industry and that I was connected to this thing. But I just loved the place, and I loved that people could wear what they wanted, and I met these new interesting people, and it wasn't the kind of same backbiting that you got at school and all that stuff. It was just I'm here all week. I get to do something that I'm remotely interested in. Still didn't have a clue in terms of career. It was I started to get a sense that there was this design industry and what have you, and but it was always eggs in one basket. I just followed the thing that I enjoyed doing. That was it.
So it
But
wasn't like in your time at college, they weren't kind of working with you to sort of show you routes out of college, sort of at the time you finished. Like, oh, here's the subject, and this is what you could do with this particular part of your course. Or was it more kind of geared up towards you do the course, you get a degree, like that's the route that
it
you
was
followed?
it was somewhere in between. So the tutors were good in terms of connecting your interests with the broader art and design world. So I'd show up with a wrestling VHS cover that I designed in my own time because I was obsessed with professional wrestling, and my tutor would sort of close his eyes and shake his head, and but then go and find a book of Peter Blake's wrestling posters from the '60s, which I never knew existed. So suddenly he's very cleverly connected me with Peter Blake and a movement of artists from that time by not dismissing something I was interested in, but just steering it somewhere better. So it was on that level. So we'd do design, they'd show you cool posters. It was never a case of that's the job that does that. Go and find out what that means. It was just a lot of getting exposed to, a lot of trying, and then it was a case of right, what do you want to go and try and find a job, or do you want to go to university? Um, and after a long time of sort of saying I didn't want to go to university and I wanted to work in the local sign writers, which I don't, I think I was just lazy, to be honest, at that point. Um, I eventually saw my friends heading off for unis and kind of went, oh shit, maybe I should do that actually. And, again, it was a lot of blind stumbling, and luckily I always had good tutors who picked up on my passions and gave me a subtle nudge. So, by the time I got to my illustration degree at Preston, which was via 1 year on a graphics degree at Bradford, which I switched from, then at that point, I think I really started to realize that I was quite good at this and I could, potentially develop and be an illustrator. So, again, what that meant, I didn't truly know. I just knew that it was freelance and that I'd have to build a portfolio and go out to market and find out what that meant.
You never had the intention of sort of leaving and joining like a design agency or an illustration house or working in house with somewhere. You always sort of thought, I want to be freelance. I want to do this on my own steam.
Kind of. Again, I was never overly motivated. It was just a sort of I got this portfolio now, and this is how this illustration world works. And I'm not really a designer, so I'll go out there and to find out how that is. And only into sort of later second year did I get some impetus, and that was really because I worked at the factory my dad worked at for many years. My dad worked there. A full-time 40-hour standard job really, and but he liked it. He had his mates there. It was there was a lot of perks for him. It fed the family and everything else. But for a brain like mine, which is I guess quite imaginative and needs variation, things like putting stickers on boxes and pulling pallets around it, I didn't like it. And it gave me some money for my term time at university, but beyond that it put a bit of fear into me that actually I have put my eggs in one basket, and if I don't find my motivation, this is my alternative because I haven't got anything else, and the job market in this town is not great. So it was kind of like, oh shit. So that's when some real sparks started to come, and I got the sketchbooks out in the evening and started really trying to understand who I was and what my visual style might look like to give myself a good chance of being an illustrator. And so it was more of a kind of what I don't want to do that pushed me towards what I do want to do, rather than knowing where I wanted to go.
I think that's a fair point. I think a lot of people have that. I don't know what I want to do, but it's definitely not that.
Yeah.
And that kind of spurs you on to, I guess, kind of find that motivation, find that passion, and really get out the door. So you say like find your style. Now, I mean this in the nicest possible way. Your style is quite loose, quite scrappy. It's
Hmm.
very kind of free flowing. It's not finessed. Was there any kind of point at which you thought, this isn't good enough, or I can't put this out because it's not picture perfect. It's not everything is exactly as it should be. Or did you have that kind of confidence in your art and in your style to sort of go, no, this is what I'm doing, and this is what I want to put out there?
There was always a degree of confidence, and I wouldn't say always. It was a kind of hard learned lesson at college at BTEC level. Um, there's and I told this story in detail in Champagne and Wax Crayons, my first book, because I think it's a valuable one. And there was two of the tutors on my BTEC, and they lost their rag with me one day. What those tutors were really good at was identifying a character and teaching accordingly. So they would never have. They gave me a proper bollocking. Basically, it was like I was doing all this really lovely, lively life drawing, these paintings, these expressive sketches, and they were like, "Oh, you're really getting there now. This drawing style is really starting to come out, and it's very you. It reflects your character." But then I'd go back to the studio project that we had longer on, and it would just be so stagnant and so frozen. And I was trying to get everything perfect and replicate these kind of graphic styles that I didn't understand they were made digitally in my hand drawing style. And it killed these tutors. They were like, "Oh, why have you relapsed back to this again?" And they just lost their rag one day and took me into a separate studio, properly shouted at me, got held up the life drawings and went, "We want to see this in this." I always remember they got this set of paints out and said, "Here's a set of like Dale Rowney acrylics. Keep them, use them. It's on the house because you're into this. You work hard. You'll make good use of them. But we're going to go next door, and if we don't come back and see that replicated in that, we're going to fucking kill you," kind of thing. And it was like, okay. So they left me in this big empty studio, and I'm kind of there going, shit. So I just kind of just loosened up, went for it, came back and went, "That's what we're talking about, but and do never go back to that. Like, you can't, it's not you." And don't get me wrong, I've had slight relapses over the years, but ultimately I started to see the value because I went from merits to distinctions towards the tail end of that course because I was doing this more expressive stuff that chimed with who I was. And they'd seen that from day one, but it just takes time to break that in people. But they did that, and it stuck with me. So I was always, by the time I got to university, I was drawing quite expressively and I was using loose textures. And it was very amateurish, don't get me wrong. It took a long time to refine that, but and find the difference between what looks good and what is just kind of amateurish. But I was on the path by that point. So from when they broke me onwards, I always had the confidence that less could be more, you know? And I always remember looking at Shrigley's work and kind of thinking, well, why does anyone like that? I don't understand. That's too naive. That's rubbish. But actually, once I got that, again, it was another turning point. And it does take time to embrace that because perfectionism is something that's kind of in us. That's what we get shown from day one. Oh, that portrait's getting better now. It's looking more like that person. And like no parent ever sort of goes, that Picasso thing's better than that, because we all try to get better, like technically better. That's just a natural path, I think.
Yeah, I think you do want to get technically better, but there's understanding. I think there's something that you kind of learn as you get older is that technical better isn't the same as better. Like there's things can be better without looking pixel perfect. They can be better without being train spotting. It's widely regarded as being an excellent work of fiction. It's not. It's all written in Glaswegian, like all of the dialogue, and that's not. It's not better. Like you could write that in fluent, in proper English, and that would be technically better. But
Mm-hmm.
for the book that it is and the message that it gets across, having all written in Glaswegian is something else, and that's the sort of the atmosphere and the vibe that was kind of implied by the book, and it kind of gets that message across really well. So like you've gone through college, kind of gone through uni, sort of found your style. What was the route to getting your first commission? Like, if you can remember, sort of who your very first client was, coming out as a freelance illustrator.
Yeah, it was. Well, I had a bit of a tough time after graduation because I really the cut off from tutorial input, and then the lack of peers around me on a day-to-day basis, and the lack of studio space was kind of a triple hit, really, to my progress. So I left, and that was it. It was like I knew that I had to be freelance. I didn't really know where to take things. I hadn't developed any kind of style yet that I was confident in. So I worked full time for 2 years, and I remember saying to myself when I graduated, if 2 years, for some reason, 2 years felt like a realistic target to be freelance. So I said to myself, right, I'm going to work full time for anything up to 2 years and hopefully make that work. And I said 2 years because Euro 2008 would be the next major football tournament, and I hated that thing of having to phone in sick to watch a game, or or like not see it all live. So that felt like a realistic enough goal to me to be under my own duress by that point. And also I was aware of was that financial pressure wouldn't be good for me. And I knew friends who jumped straight in and done a sink or swim, living off scraps and really kind of doing it a beg, steal, or borrow way. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have some savings and I wanted to take a proper run at being freelance and have, a bit of backup. So I just worked in full time jobs, and some of them were great. Like I loved working at Waterstone's bookshop because it felt like everyone had something that was theirs outside of that job, and we all felt quite impassioned. So it was a nice place to work. There was a good energy there, and I love books, so that was cool. I was always exposed to the new illustration compendium or graphic design book that was coming in on the art shelf. So that was cool. That was a good place to be. And then just other random factory jobs, which were not as good, but again, gave me that sense of I don't want to be doing this forever, but it does pay me full time. So I just kept saving, saving, saving. And then I was at Preston City Council working as a recycling officer, where I managed to pick up that job because I'd contacted them with a really awful portfolio at that point. It was nowhere near. I was trying to do what I do now, but I just didn't have the ability to do it, and it was very clunky and very rigid. Um, so I contacted them, but they liked it, and they commissioned me to do this little recycling calendar, which was pretty good money for what it was. I think it was 800 quid at the time. And, for somebody who was earning nowhere near that in my week to week job for full time, it was like, fucking hell, that's all right. That's pretty good. What I delivered was awful. I mean, it was really terrible. But they liked it. They made it work. And it only went out to students. It was kind of, let's do something a bit younger and funkier to get out to students to make them want to recycle more. But that got me a full time gig at the council, which was a nice varied job. So I saved up 3 months worth of money and then quit that job and took a run at it. And while I knew I would have to be extremely fortunate to go full time and stay full time, I knew I'd be back at least part time. It did get me my first few commissions, and the first major one, the first properly published thing, was When Saturday Comes, which were somewhere between fanzine and glossy football magazine. And I'd been knocking on that door pretty persistently because I got what felt like some genuine interest, as opposed to thanks for your email, we've got you on file, speak to you soon. And I'm not saying those people weren't genuine because they often are, but to me, it felt like When Saturday Comes kind of went, oh, this is quite loose and organic. This is quite on brand. He knows football. We don't need to teach him the subject matter for quite short turnaround jobs. And eventually that paid off, and I got 150 quid commission to illustrate. I remember it was Ian Wright who had taken on the role of presenting Gladiators at the time when they tried that reboot. um, so it was like a satirical piece on that, and they loved because it was a lot of smart comment pieces by good writers, and so it needed that illustrator insight to bring that to life visually. So I think I brought something really valuable to them. They certainly brought a lot of value to me because the art director Doug Cheeseman was just brilliant. He was so patient, and he really learned to tap into the little idiosyncrasies that are quite prevalent in my style now, the little scribbles and the little bits of commentary and hand lettering. He really pushed me to develop that side of things. So that was a really, really good education. And he was great. So I worked with them pretty regularly. And then it was like the Big Issue, Southwest, and a few other kind of low level editorial commissions. But, it started to get me to a point where it felt like this was realistic to go full time. And I went back to work at the council part time, and I mean they were brilliant. They sort of said you can change your hours last minute if we need to because we know you've got something bigger going on. You're helping us out because somebody's away on maternity leave. It helps you out because you've got a bit of part time money while you're getting started. But we know that you're off to do this thing, and we're
Oh,
going to
that's good.
support you.
That's good that they kind of
It
had
was
that
it was my
recognition.
it was
Yeah.
brilliant, yeah, because they didn't have to do that. A lot of bosses could be arseholes about that, and I've seen that happen many a time. But they weren't. They were great. They really supported it. They were genuinely enthused when I got commissions and wanted to know all about it, and they felt quite proud. And it was like that was really lovely, and everybody was rooting for me. So I gave them a lot back in return. I worked hard until that job was no longer, and then so I was kind of pushed because that was pulled. The maternity person came back. Suddenly that job was no more. And I remember the Big Issue Southwest columnist stopped writing the column. So that was pulled in the same afternoon. I remember it well because I freaked out and was like, oh my God. But that fear really propelled me. I was like, well, now I've got no choice but to make this work.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, because you like in your sort of illustration career, you've done some pretty big things. I was just sort of thinking back I mean, it would have been about 10 years ago when I saw you give the talk for Champagne and Wax Crayons in 10 Feet Tall in Cardiff, I think. You were saying stuff like you've done stuff for WWE, you've done stuff for the Guardian. Have you done stuff for the Premier League?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, like, what's been your favourite kind of commission that you got given? Is it one of the big name ones like WWE, or is it one of the smaller ones that you just thought actually this was, even though it's a much smaller, it probably one of the not the proudest bit of work that you've done, but the best one that you've done. However you quantify best.
Good question. I don't know. It's probably. I mean, my brain always goes back to the Faces of Evil, which was a WWE one. It was a big editorial, so like ran over 15 pages, and they basically did all these kind of shots of the villains, and I created physical hand painted sets that they shot behind them with a mixture of their visuals and their kind of catchphrases and whatever else. And they shot this really moody thing where it was very old school, stripped back. It felt like an old boxing shoot. So they were in these old derelict rooms or against like garage doors and things. And the reality, that's an interesting one because the reality of that shoot was that the creative director only had very limited stuff to work with, so they would only get to shoot the wrestlers themselves backstage in the arenas. So they traveled to a new city or town every day to do the live wrestling events. So they would have to grab them pre-match in their trunks or whatever and shoot them against like a shutter or a palette, for example. They were very limited in what they could do, which is why they invariably use digital backgrounds for the magazine covers. But this guy was from Bolton, Dave Hilton, he was called, creative director at the time, and he wanted to tap into that organic stuff that I did, and he saw the opportunity to use those limitations for something cool. So he said, "Look, can you create me these kind of 8 foot by 2 foot banners in Manchester, where I was living at the time, and FedEx them over to me, and we'll use them as backdrops for these shoots, and it'll be something I think will be really cool." And I loved that, and I loved working with Dave. And he really, again, another art director who just knew how to push me and get the best out of me. And so that was brilliant because I just got to make these original artworks that were shot by a really cool photographer and then color graded by, you were part of a team for this really amazing editorial project, and everybody loved that. And it got, they featured it on the blog and everything else. And it was a really wonderful project to be a part of. So on a selfish, superficial level, that was one that I'm very proud of. But really, I mean, I've always placed such a high value on my personal work. I've always been doing something in my own time. And so when I think favorite and the stuff that's really energized me on a creative level, it's probably that stuff where I've been working, on something that has come from a place of emotional creativity, as in, I don't have to do this, but I've got something to say and I want to work in this field. And here's something I've wanted to try for a while or collaborate with that person. And it's something where there's been a degree of freedom and explosivity. So, at the same time, I do love the parameters of client work. So I think you can grow. I think you have to do both, and you really grow if you do.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really important to be not like, obviously doing stuff for other people pays the bills, gets the money in, and that's the stuff that you got to do. But I feel like if you focus exclusively on doing stuff for other people, you dry up a bit. You sort of run out of steam, and you need that, like the curiosity and the curious nature within all creative people. I think kind of bubbles up to the surface, and at some point you've got to give yourself that room to play and try something out. Like this last couple of weeks, I haven't got that much work on at the moment, but it's fine because I'm not going to stress about finding the work. The work will come. I'm just gonna I've wanted to do some video editing for a while, so I've gone out, done some filming, done some video editing. There's some projects I wanted to work on with a couple of friends. We got that going, and I know that that's great right now, and it's going to be an absolute killer in 2 weeks' time when some project lands on me that I'm like, right now I've got to stop doing all this fun stuff and go back to doing the paid stuff. But you've got to do the paid stuff, and then it's peaks and troughs, and it's that kind of work that keeps your interest up, I think, and that's kind of really important.
Well, it is, and your direction always comes from within. So your compass is your personality and your character. It has to be, and as you grow within your life, you change, and therefore so does your creativity. So the things that were energizing me 15, 16 years ago when I started, it's not that I don't still love the work, or at least some of it, and see the value in that, but I've moved on so much as a person, like all of us do over time. And if you don't, my friend called it course correction, and I thought that was a really good way to look at it. If you don't course correct at various stages and check in with yourself to know what you are passionate about and where you want to go, then the thing that you were doing 10 years ago, if you're still just doing the same thing and you haven't given yourself time to do what you just said, which is play and check in with yourself, then of course you're gonna stagnate. And what happens with it is if you're not consciously aware that that's changed and you haven't course corrected, you then start the next step is to start questioning your own creativity and your own motivation. And do I want to do this anymore? And do I love it like I once did? The answer is going to be no, because you've changed as a human being and a lot of time has passed, you know? So that's why it's really important to keep doing that new personal work, because it's through doing that, the freedom that enables you, that's where you get your sort of clues as to what you might want to do next and where you want to take your practice.
Obviously, we talked about how you love books and how books was a passion, and English as a subject, and that. How did it come about? Sort of the book number one. Sort of it was off the back of a blog, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah,
How did it?
I was frustrated. I'd done 2 years and had a really good run of it, and I hit this dry spell of about 6 weeks, which is really quite common. I realise now after 16 years, but I was, at the time, what the hell's happening? This shouldn't be going on 2 years in, and got quite angry and ranted on this Tumblr blog basically, and it's kind of like the reality of freelancing and what you don't see on Instagram and that kind of mentality. But it was a little bit venomous. But over time, I became a better writer and objectified that a bit more, and told it in a way that was a bit more humorous and could share that with other people. But what was lovely, I got the feedback from about 5 or 6 people who would read this stuff regular because I would share it on Twitter, was that it was something that everyone was going through, and the humor and the kind of downtrodden narrative resonated with people. So I kept writing and I got better at that, and read a lot more, and learned how to strip that back to something that wasn't overworked. And that, I'm untrained in that field. I've got no formal background apart from English GCSE. So I had to kind of earn my stripes there. But I loved it so much, and I should have been, it would have, again, it's another should have. I should have been marketing to illustration clients to turn the tide during this quiet spell. Instead, I was off telling the story about it over here on Tumblr.
Yeah,
But again, like we said, because I was giving myself the time to do that and trust, and it wasn't even that I was doing it thinking this might go somewhere. It was just something that I felt strongly like I had to do, and I was enjoying it. Simple as that. So I kept doing it because I enjoyed it, and eventually, because I would talk about this stuff a lot, and I knew that there was this tiny audience of 5 people, that justified me doing it. And I remember mentioning it to Laura, who's my wife now, and I was dating at the time. She was in London, I was in Manchester, and she mentioned it to David Woods Hale, who's been my editor ever since, and he was working at a small publishing house called Lid in London, and he said that sounds really interesting. We do business books, not so much arts, but that sounds like there might be a niche within our catalogue for a title like that. Can I have a look at it? So I sent him what by that point I'd developed into a very rudimentary manuscript in Microsoft Word, and he loved it. And they offered me a book deal, and I actually turned it down the first time. And about 6 months later, I just didn't feel like I was ready. And then about 6 months later, after I'd got a bit of a better handle on it, I came back and said, "Is it still on the table?" And they still wanted to work with me, and that was it. He very much held my hand through the publishing process and was a great first editor to work with. Still is. But yeah, it was amazing. It was very surreal, to see this book coming out. It was very accidental, but it just goes to show the value of passion and letting, let's call it screaming at the sky a little bit. It was we all have those animalistic responses and frustrations and anger, and you've got to let that out sometimes. And if you can do that in a creative arena, it really does give you some impetus and some drive and direction.
yeah, and I think writing is something that I always want to do more of, but I never get. I always like sit down to start doing it, and then I don't know, I get filled with like self doubt and disbelief about I can't do it because I don't, like you say, I've got a background in it. I love reading, but I just whenever I sit down to start writing, I lose confidence instantly, which is it's a real pain. But yeah, something that I think I always want to pick up and try. And yeah, it's good to hear that you kind of come at it from that background of not having an English writing degree or anything like that, but
Yeah,
still wanted to pursue it anyway. So yeah, you kind of come off the back of the first book, and then what is it? Eight years later, book number two is now coming out.
nine
9
years later.
years.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it
The
was
difficult second
publishing.
book.
Yeah. Well, I said I did that, and I didn't know if I was going to do anything else again. It was like, well, I kept writing. I've written semi regularly for Design Week over the years and done occasional opinion pieces for like Creative Review and things, but never in a way that I had a plan for a second book. It was kind of like, well, that thing came out of me naturally. If that happens again, so be it. But I'm not going to push it. So, but podcasting was the next step. That's what happened after Champagne and Wax Crayons, and it was very much the case of I started getting asked to lecture at universities and do bits of teaching here and there because of the stuff that the media that I was doing through Champagne and Wax Crayons. And suddenly it gives you this kind of currency in the industry as a bit of a voice. And I had great fun with that. I loved that somebody was asking me to come and talk at their place and pay me a couple of £100. It was like, it's brilliant. So I did a lot of that. And then I thought, well, how can I do more of this? So I went to Harry Lyon Smith, who is the MD of Illustration X, who are my illustration representatives. And I said to Harry, I know you're starting this news section of the website to share the inside story of the projects that you're doing with clients. Is there anything I could cover there as on like a journalistic level? Could I write a blog or what, And he said, no, there's no opportunities within the agency for that. We don't really have any budget to pay to do that. However, we do have a marketing budget, and I love the idea of a podcast. And it turns out Harry and I both listen to a lot of podcasts each week back in 2016. And he said, if you're willing to learn to do it, go away and do it and build the thing, we'll sponsor it. And this massive leap of faith for somebody who'd never picked up a microphone or never done anything in the world of broadcasting, but it was like, okay, well, there's a bit of extra money. Like, yeah, all right, I'll go in, go on YouTube and give it a bash. And we live in this world where we've got all these tutorials at our fingertips and these ways to learn independently, which is what I did, and I loved it. And I'm a talker, and I've always loved talking about creativity and understanding human nature and characters, and that's the writer's brain in me. And it came quite naturally. I found that I could get conversations out of people quite easily and make them feel at ease. And that's a skill as an interviewer, and it was something that was there quite natural. And much like the writing, I hadn't had the natural style coached out of me. And in both fields, it meant that I had to do a bit of legwork to learn properly, get up on my grammar a bit better. And, sometimes the sound's been a little off on the podcast because I'm not technically trained. However, what I had that other people didn't was this natural ability that hadn't been coached out of me. And I had a unique voice like everybody does. And more importantly, I had the trust in that voice because I'd learned to trust myself in the illustration world. And these things are kind of thematic. It's not so much restricted to illustrate, like creativity itself. I found that if I could bring my personality to each of these fields, it gave it the same unique voice, albeit in a different discipline.
So that was how did you, you've been given free reign to sort of go do the podcast, and you wanted to speak to people about creativity. Originally, it was called Arrest All Mimics, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And then it evolved into the creative condition. What was the, how did you find sort of the finding guests and because like this, I've kind of had to, I put a pause in season 1 of the podcast to sort of do season 2 because I just found the ongoing slog. I mean, slog's a bad word, but it was becoming a bit of a grind of like find the guest, book the guest, interview the guest, edit the episode, release the episode, right, next one, and then week on week on week, and doing that. So how did you kind of how did you keep that energy with it week on week? Because you're 200 episodes in now, aren't you?
Yeah. I mean, if you total it all up, including the episodes that I haven't given a number, which is I do this whole series called Creative Stories, which I punctuate the main episodes with. So we're up to about 250 out of all them. So the honest answer is I don't know. I guess it's passion for the topic that keeps me going, really, because I haven't ever really sort of earned enough to justify the time I put into it. I hope so moving forward. Now that I've got this book out, I want to create this model where I can give talks and do creative coaching and things and actually change that. But I don't know. I just fell in love with this idea that creativity is something more than just being artistically talented, because so many people don't think they're creative because of that, and they fall on that sword, much to the detriment in their own lives. And I think that's really sad. Particularly like we mentioned earlier on, kids in education who've maybe had a tough start in their life and don't have the guidance that I benefited from, who have loads of ability and loads of positive energy if they just knew where to place that, but they don't, and they end up in trouble because of it. So I want to help those people, and I've always felt just so much magic in creativity and drawn to it and wanted to better understand it beyond just the arts and help people. Even the thing is, it always ends up coming back to the creative industry because so many people in our industry still don't have a good understanding of creativity. They might be a good technically trained designer or a creative director or whatever else, but if you're not in tune with the person you are and the way your brain works and everything else that goes into creativity, you just feel sometimes like you're walking in the dark a little bit, and just applying for the next job or sticking with that because that's what you know. Whereas actually, we've all got a great degree of creativity. That's what human beings are, and I think that the more interest I found in that topic, the more drive it gave me to do the podcast. So it's ebbed and flowed in terms of sometimes it's been monthly, sometimes it's been bi-weekly, sometimes it's been weekly. It's weekly at the moment because the book's out and I'm feeling particularly up on it. But I've never been afraid to kind of change that if my motivation lagged a little bit.
I mean, that's definitely a confidence thing as well. It goes back to having the confidence to sort of go, actually, I'm not doing it this week. I'm gonna take a break. I'm gonna put a pin in it and kind of refine it a bit more and go away, do something else, come back to it, freshen it up a bit, and yeah, sort of breathe new life into it. So yeah, the book, it's all about creativity, bringing creativity into, not bringing creativity, recognizing the creativity in everyone's everyday life. And so, like, the list of people that you interviewed for it is quite impressive, actually. What was the kind of was it hard to get people to speak about creativity, or were people quite open to sort of coming on board and recognizing that this is a problem, that people aren't seeing the creativity in their everyday lives?
I think people were very willing, to be honest. They were like people. I think it's anything from a nice little ego rub when you get asked to be on something, right through to the people who shared the same passion that I did for it. Like I had, for example, Professor Anna Abrahams is a neuroscientist who specializes in creativity. She's based in the States, originally from India, and I saw her doing the rounds on a couple of other things, and I fell in love with what she was talking about straight away. So I approached her thinking she's not gonna do this. My numbers aren't up to scratch compared to the shows I'd seen her on. But she was all in. She immediately got back and said, "Yeah, I'd love to. You might have to bear with me. I've got a busy schedule at the university where she's a professor." But she was up for it, and it's the same thing with a lot of people. I just had another professor, Athena Actopis, who is she's in the psychology department at the Arizona State University, and she's just brought a book out called A Field Guide to the Apocalypse, which is amazing. And it's heavy subject matter to do with things like the climate crisis, but it's just done in such a creative way and a positive way in that we've always had bad shit to deal with as human beings, but we have to find a place of fun and optimism to tackle those problems with creativity. And she does it through the lens of a zombie apocalypse. Um, so it's a less intimidating way of dealing with a heavy topic. And it's really, really great. And she's just a force of nature and she's amazing. And I asked her thinking I'd have no chance. And she was, up for it really quite quickly. So other times you have to sort of time it when somebody's got something to push. Someone's got a book out or they've got a new album out or whatever else. Or you had to work a connection. Like my dog was best friends with Sean Ryder's dog in Manchester, from the Happy Mondays, and those dog walks, which were usually with Sean's wife Joanne, who was amazing. She managed him in the Mondays and kind of managed him as a human. And Joanne was very creative in her own right, so she was always interested in my stories about these things that I was working on, and so she just said, "Look, anytime Sean and I can help you out, give us a shout." And they lived like 2 streets away, so so I managed to get that interview through that, and then Alan McGee came off the back of that because they also worked with Alan, and it was just like so. But I've always been very good at that, and I've found a great passion for the kind of hustling side of it, and I just love the buzz of that unknown and where's that next exciting thing coming from. And if I need to be a bit cheeky or kind of bustle my way in somewhere to make that happen, I've never been afraid to do that. And I think that goes back to the school thing, which was a big takeaway from school, was that we were quite a big school, so that meant a lot of dickheads, and which had its massive value. I want my kids to be exposed to dickheads for the same reasons, because it makes you manage rich characters, and you have to learn how to sort of get by in these intimidating situations. Which now, as a podcaster and somebody who has to kind of make his own opportunities in illustration or whatever field, that is really valuable.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think that, yeah, getting the kids to deal with dickheads. So my two, yeah, they're dealing with their friends in school, like proper schoolyard dramas we hear about all the time. Like, oh, she called me a poo poo head. Like, honestly, you're sick. Like, it doesn't matter. Just leave. Just ignore it. It's fine. But yeah,
Yeah.
there are arguments that they're having, and you're just like, oh, the like to think that the the level of importance they put on these things as young people, as an adult, you just sort of don't like. That's not important. That doesn't matter. There
Yeah.
is no relevance to that whatsoever in life. But it's like a day. It's a day ruiner for them.
Oh yeah, we can
Yeah,
laugh it off now, knowing what we know, but it was very real at the time. I remember that much. So
it's just madness. So yeah, like book is out now, and I guess like what are you up to next? Have you got any more books in the works, or are you just
mm,
gonna keep going?
I mean, I do, but I should. I do and I don't. So I write fiction as well, and that's I had to make it. I had to make a decision to push that into my own time in the evenings and the weekends and things because I was just doing way too much, especially as a twin parent. And I was only skimming the surface in everything. You know, I was neglecting my illustration a little bit. I wasn't giving everything to the creative condition because I was busy writing, horrible little stories about local characters and things like that. I will continue to do that because, like I mentioned earlier, that's my outlet for my emotional creativity, and that's really quite important to me. But that's a slow burner. So in question, there are other books, but they'll probably come out and be read by 5 people. But it's something that I need to do, and I'll continue to do. But no, not in terms of the nonfiction. Not at this point. Like this has got a long shelf life. You know, this is 10 years. This book in the making. So from when I first did interviewing, which was again very accidental, just an opportunity that I got through this campaign I did for Calm, which was a campaign against living miserably, and it was to do with suicide prevention and mental health. That's when I learned I could interview people and get decent conversations out of them. So from then onwards, that's not really stopped that exploration, and it's been 10 years, which has amounted to this book off the back of the podcast. But moving forward, I will continue to expand the book with each new edition and each new interview that I feel can benefit it. But this is my thing now going forward. You know, I'm going to continue to work my illustration clients, and that's what's paying my bills at the moment. But I want to teach and help people understand creativity and help them to embrace it better. Like I said, people who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, but also people in our industry, and because I just think that we face a lot of big problems in the world today, and we're going to need creativity. To be at the core of the solutions to those problems. It's always been the way throughout human history. So I want to elevate the value of creativity in our society. So I want to plug into organizations that are bigger than me that can help me to facilitate that and team up with all those people. So really, this book is kind of a key into that world, as is this podcast, and I will continue to do the two and push the two. But really, as a father of 2 young kids, like I want them to grow up and by the time they get to secondary school, I would love it if there was a little more value on creativity and things had changed for the better. And I want to be a part of that change. And, I went through a long time of thinking there's too many things in the world that I want to change. I'm just one person, and this is really stressful and overwhelming. And ultimately, I landed on this one cause, which is creativity. And if that's not a valid cause, given that it's a very reason for our survival as a species, then I don't know what is. And that's given me a lot of mental solace to have this one thing to focus on. Because also within that one thing, there's so much that you can cover. So it's lovely to have some parameters.
Because I think you can get overwhelmed with the amount. There's so like the situation in the Middle East, global warming. There's an endless amount of things that you can be upset and can drain your energy. Like if you try to solve all of the world's problems, you're going to burn out. You can't possibly like. I sometimes sit back and look at the state of the world and just think, "That's just shit, isn't it? Like everything's shit right now." But it's quite, I don't know, it's a really positive outlook that you've got there where you think, well, I'm not solving I'm yeah, no I'm not trying to solve any one particular problem. I'm trying to give people the tools to solve any number of problems. Like creativity is not I'm not sol yeah I'm giving people the tools to help them solve these problems themselves rather than go all in and burn out trying to solve every single problem myself, because you can get so overwhelmed with it all.
Very much so. Yeah.
I think.
And I'm sorry. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, yeah, it's just hard to manage that emotion, and like you look at just the state of everything, and I start avoid watching the news now, just because it just every day you're like, what's going on now? Like what how I don't have the energy or the mental space to sort of worry about all of this stuff, because it's just unbelievably hard to kind of look at all this stuff that's going on now.
Yeah, and it did. It had quite a detrimental effect on me. Like I've never suffered with depression or anything like that, but in the first couple of years of being a parent, I was just exhausted all the time for obvious reasons, and um, and that left me in a more vulnerable state than I've ever been in before. And I really let the climate crisis get on top of me in a way that I didn't need to get that bad. You know, it was kind of, I was quiet a lot of the time around the house, and I was always dwelling on something, always worrying. I'd see one heavy headline and it would trigger this, what I now understand is the fight or flight instinct. And that's our evolutionary response to things we perceive as threats. And when that happens, our brain kickstarts the stress response, which floods the body with, anxiety, with adrenaline, and gets you into a highly alert state. But the fallout from that is quite damaging, because then you pull every other little problem in your life, or every little negative thing you see, or big negative thing you see, into that same cesspit, and it just keeps you down there. And that's what starts this kind of horrible process that I was in. A big turning point was that establishing one cause to apply myself to feel like I was making a difference. And like you say, it's a foundational thing to solve problems, which is really, really valid. But also, the news is designed to generate that response, and that doesn't diminish the severity of the problems it's reporting on. So things like Ukraine, horrific; Middle East, awful, heinous. I can't find the words to kind of to express how bad that stuff is. But it's and this was something that was in Stefan Sagmeister's latest book, Now is Better. So Stefan and I just did a live interview at Off Festival in Barcelona about long term thinking and about optimism. And Stefan's book had a profound impact on me, because it's a beautiful example of a design slash art project that is working towards something that's way bigger than any of us. And it's about, so what Stefan did was took all these classic paintings that he bought from like auction houses or got from his grandparents, and he's edited them with these kind of statistical representations, artistic representations of stats and data about human history and the progression that we've had. So it looks at everything from child mortality rates to starvation to even to do with the climate crisis. He's looking at, there's one graphic that shows the increase in protected marine areas, for example. So he writes about this. It's not head in the sand. He's not going that everything is just better, full stop. But he's saying that if you look at the longer range, if you get out of the news headlines of like Twitter and things like that, and look at where we've come as a species, in the vast majority of things, we're in a far better place today than we ever were. And his thing is, it's important to address things like the Middle East and the climate crisis from a place of recognizing those past successes, so that we can get in an optimistic headspace and we can tackle those problems from a better space. Because his thing was, if we're just, he said, like, if I'm depressed, I'm terrible to my partner, I'm of no value to the people around me, and I'm certainly not going to create like I can create. But if I can recognize those past successes and feel a little bit better about the world, I'm going to attack the problems that we do have to address from a far better place. And that, again, was a big turning point for me, because it was like, yeah, there's no point me sitting here and being all mopey and down about everything in this studio, because then I'm not doing anything. I'm not contributing. I'm not helping myself or other people. So actually, it's good to feel that fear and that anger sometimes about causes that we need to address. But ultimately, you have to get back to a good equilibrium, so that you can create and you can attack those problems. That's the
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
So,
Do you think that being creative is sometimes a bit of a cathartic kind of process as well? That you feel quite upset about things that are going on in the world and the way that the world is looking and the way the world is turning, and then to be able to create anything, write an article, create an illustration, create anything as a way of like venting that kind of frustration. Do you sort of feel that, kind of recognize that as a way of getting that frustration out and that anger and that
oh,
anxiety?
God, yeah, hell yeah. I mean, it's always been a crutch for me. And actually attribute that as a major part of why I haven't particularly struggled in my life mentally, because I've always had that to go to. And it could just be something for me. It could just be journaling. It could just be writing something down. But the act of recognizing and addressing that thing through artistic expression is just so valuable. Comedians do it all the time. And the thing is, what makes us good at this job is often heightened sensitivity. There's a lot of highly sensitive people in our world, because we see the world in more textures than people who are not overly sensitive. And I recently interviewed Jen Granneman, who's an expert in introversion and sensitivity, highly sensitive people. And the way, she said, look, the way human race is kind of divided is about 30% are highly sensitive. That means they're really attuned to their environment. They feel the good things really good. The lows, they tend to suffer a bit lower than other people. Then there's about 40% who are somewhere in between. And then 30% are not, they're more pragmatic, they're more logically minded, they're not particularly sensitive. And society is, none of that is good or bad. It just simply, society wouldn't work without that balance, because I certainly need people around me who are more pragmatic and less sensitive than me to pull me out of my own ass sometimes. So it's like, otherwise I would sit there in those spirals if I had, if I was allowed to be exposed to that part of myself too much. But because of that sensitivity, yeah, I think it's important that we use the good side of it to channel the bad side. Fiction writing, I mentioned to you earlier, it's my last fiction collection, Stories for the Apocalypse #2, is, I mean, there's some real personal venting going on in there. Through characters, I create these fictional stories and characters to express what I'm feeling in a way that other people can relate to them. But very much so, particularly in reference to the climate crisis, very much hitting on those themes through that work, you know. And I knew that it wouldn't be read by a lot of people, but I needed to do that for me. That wasn't about selling books. That was about saying something I had just had to say. Otherwise, that would be bottled up and would cause me harm.
Yeah. It's creating for creating's sake rather than commerciality. I think is another really important thing there. With sometimes you just have to make something, and that is fine. If no one reads it, if no one looks at it, if no one buys it, if no one listens to it, if you're the only person who's created it, you've still created it, and you've got that out of your system.
Mhm.
Whereas I think a lot of people, yeah, kind of going back to touching on the confidence thing that if you've made something and you don't think it's good enough, you don't think it's good enough, that's fine, but you've done it, you've got the practice, and you don't have to. Not everything has to be a commercial success. Not everything has to be put out to the wider world. Sometimes you can just make stuff and then put it on a shelf and then come back to it because you sort of like you've almost created a snapshot in time of how you're feeling about a certain subject. We are. We're still okay for time, but I'm sure I could talk for ages. Absolutely ages. So yeah, going back on what I first said, there's only two questions that I've really structured this with: is which stuff in school, and the last one being, if you could go back and do anything differently, is there any part of your career that you would change or like to do in a slightly different way?
No, no, I don't see the world that way. I think that we're all on a bit of a trajectory in our lives, and I didn't realize I had a writer's brain until my late 30s. So I could look at that through the lens of, oh, God, what if I started writing when I was 20? Couldn't have happened. That wasn't my path. I had to find it the way I found it, and it's the same with all of it. No, I wouldn't change anything in school. I wouldn't change anything in my career. I think that there's so much joy in like you said, those things that are not perfect and those mistakes along the way. How else do you get to how else do you find where you're meant to be if not by screwing up a few times?
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, I've got a T-shirt on as we speak from Off Festival, and it's this year's. I don't know if you can see it, but it just says "fuck around and find out." And I love that. It's perfect because that's what that festival's about. People are there telling stories, and don't get me wrong, the talks are all great. Some of them, it's very much like, here's this big thing we did for Nike, and here's what it did and how it succeeded, and they're great. But the ones for me are the vulnerable talks, the talks where people share stories about how they did mess up and what they had to go through to get to that amazing thing. That's the real stuff where you learn. And we all have to do that. None of it's perfection. No one opens a MacBook for the first time and knows how to design something that is an iconic piece of work. You can't just contrive it that way. It has to be felt. You have to go through all the emotions and the screw ups to get there. So no, I wouldn't change a thing. I wouldn't change a thing at all. And I think it was Ricky Gervais who I heard interviewed on what was it, 60 Minutes. It was a show in America, and they asked him about the office breaking when he was about to turn 40, and he said, I thought about this and I spoke to my partner about it and said, why is this only happened to me now at 40? Why didn't I've been trying to create all my life? And she said, well, why do you think you had to go through all that middle management experience in office jobs to make all those observations and all those references that made David Brent one of the best observed characters of all time in that sitcom? And it speaks for itself. So he couldn't have done it on any quicker because he didn't. I think that's the way you have to see it. Otherwise, you end up in regret, and then you stop making better decisions now because you're too busy looking back at what could have been. So, it's
Yeah. I think when I when I first started asking that question, I always thought, there'll be some people who are like, oh, I wish I'd done this sooner, I wish I'd done that sooner. But pretty much everyone has come up with the exact same answer of no. It's just maybe one thing. Maybe I wish I think was a captain from Boomtown was like, I kind of wish I'd partied so much when I was younger because I'm paying the price for it a bit now. um, but that sort of like, yeah, I think it's really important to hear the same answer from a variety of people is actually proving to be one of the better things about asking that question, is that all these people who are ended up in places they want to be in their career have come to it and they're in their late 30s, early 40s, late 40s, and they've all gone, no, I wouldn't change it. Like I've ended up where I am and I've got
Yeah.
no real regrets about the steps I've taken, because if I hadn't gone through this and that and the other, then I wouldn't be the person I am today, and I'd have a very different outlook on life. And I think that's it's a really positive message for people to hear. So yeah,
Mhm.
amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that.
That was my pleasure. And just to add to that a little bit, the best piece of advice I can give on that is just to slow down a little bit and spend time with yourself, doing the things that you enjoy doing. And to go back to Stefan, one of the questions I asked him was about his sabbaticals. He famously takes a 1 year sabbatical every 7 years. And that he also acknowledged the fact that not everyone's in a position to do that. And, he worked very hard for those first 7 years of his studio, working for clients like the Rolling Stones, doing album covers. But the way he put it, album cover 28 was nowhere near as exciting as album cover number one. And he
Yeah.
recognized that it was diminishing returns in terms of his own emotional creativity. So after 7 successful years and they'd done well financially, he was in a position to take a sabbatical and said it felt absolutely terrifying. They thought they were going to lose all their clients, come back, and the industry would have moved on. So it always felt like a gamble. But in that year off, he was able to see the wood for the trees. He could just take some time to be himself again. And once you do that, whenever I go away on holiday for even 5 days, come day three, I'm uncontainable because my unconscious has had time to generate all the things I've been putting in my mind, and I see the vision of where I need to go, and that's what always happens. And the way Stefan put it, he said some people do it in a very different way. Maybe they take the last hour of each day to create something just for them. It doesn't matter how you do it, how often, when you do it, as long as you are taking some time to do your own work and spend time with yourself. That's how you sort of recognize where you need to be going and avoid those eventual regrets, And again, it's that course correction. So you have to do it. You have to do those things that you feel guilty about doing because you're not getting paid for it, because you ultimately thank yourself. And so many of us spend so long with our head in our screens now, that we don't allow the unconscious to do its really valuable job, which is processing everything that we put in our minds. And if you sort of just have a bit of downtime and make sure you make time for that, I think it's one of the most valuable things you can do. And that's how you find a path that chimes with the person that you are today.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think that it's a whole other discussion with the amount of time we spend staring at screens, and I feel just so much better for not giving myself that breathing space of an evening now, instead of spending all evening watching TV, making a conscious effort to at least like 3 nights a week turn the TV off, read a book, just sit there,
Mm-hmm.
or if I'm sat in a waiting room for something, like waiting at the vets or waiting at the doctors, instead of getting my phone out and scrolling on my phone, just sitting and staring at the walls and just letting
Yeah.
that time pass and be bored. Like I think that's quite
Yeah.
it's quite an underrated thing, is spend a bit of time being bored, because
Yeah.
it's when you're bored you're letting your mind rest and process, and not be overwhelmed with constant instant gratification dopamine hits of scrolling on social media, just
Yeah.
staring at a wall for a minute and going, well, this is a bit boring, isn't it? That's good, that's great,
Yeah,
keep
it's
on doing
really good.
that.
It's really important, and it's important to recognise that it's still the Wild West in terms of social media, and it's none of it's policed at this point, and all those social media systems are designed by the smartest brains in the world to hijack evolutionary needs, things like dopamine and endorphins, and the things that make us feel good, but in this really empty, vacuous way that doesn't fulfill us. So
Yeah,
if you can be aware of that, and every time you sort of, and I do it, you habitually go for your pocket to grab your phone,
oh
stop
yeah.
and go, why am I going on this? And is it the best use of this current moment in time? If that's like an urgent client email or something, I've got to let somebody know that something important's happening, then the answer might be yes, that's fine. But don't just do it and scroll and waste another 10 minutes, because when you add that up in like, if you think of it from your deathbed self's point of view, having a conversation with your deathbed self, that's
Yeah.
one way to look at it. Will you look back and go, I used all that time to fullest and my life turned out the way it's turned out? If the answer's no and you're farting around on TikTok, then maybe put some checks in place for that, because you will regret that one day, and it is detrimental to creativity.
Yeah, for sure. I think I've kind of managed to, managed to limit my time spent on social media to exclusively when I'm on the toilet. Just because, I can't do anything else. I've got my hands are pretty occupied. So yeah, just
Yeah,
sort of, whenever I sit down on the toilet, just get the phone out, have a quick
yeah.
scroll through social media, and that's it. Then just
I
leave it alone then the rest of the time.
I wrote my second book on the toilet, more or less. It was a book called Your Mum and Other Stories from the Back Streets of Britain, and that was a project I had to do when I was a new parent, just to retain a bit of my own creativity, because
Yeah,
I wanted to be a great dad. So I was all in on that. I took 8 weeks of paternity, and it was like, but I knew that each day I just needed to have that emotional creativity outlet to retain that part of myself, so that I could be the
yeah,
best dad. And invariably, that could only happen on the dog walks or the toilet. I'm exaggerating by saying it was entirely written on the toilet, but it was probably about 60% on the toilet, because they were really short flash fiction stories that I just would bash down a paragraph and then edit it later on. And so that was like my window to get something productive done for me, where no one could come and stop me.
they'll still find a way. They'll still find a way. I think if your kids are
Oh,
anything like mine,
they do now. It's horrendous.
banging on the toilet door, Dad, what? I'm having a poo. What do you want? Have a look at this picture, Dad. No,
It's so true.
I'm on the toilet. And then our eldest now has started locking the door if she goes into the toilet, which is fine. She totally should, just like
Yeah.
she's getting to that age now. But she'll go in the toilet, lock the door, and then I'm standing outside banging on the door, like, "Will you please hurry up?" Yeah. We moved house so we could have two toilets, but that didn't mean that you can spend all day on this one. I
Yeah,
need a
yeah.
shower.
That's it.
Yeah. Sorry. Well, we've gone off on another tangent there, but thank you so much for coming on and having a chat, mate. It's been amazing, really insightful, really great to hear about everything. And yeah, the new book, of course, Creative Condition, is out now, and drop the link to buy it in the episode description. But yeah, thank you so much.
No, a pleasure's all mine, and appreciate that. Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It's been great.
No worries. Cheers, mate.
So there we go. Thank you for listening all the way through, and thank you for persevering with the dodgy audio quality. It's it's great that people have listened this far. At some points during that, we talked a bit about psychology, not psychology, but the psychological principles. If you go back to season 1 and look at episode 2. Where I talk to Rob Jones from Dash Mental Health and Wellbeing. We talk a bit about the kind of fight or flight reflex in that episode. So that's a really good episode to look at a bit. If you want a bit more detail about that sort of stuff, and to go into a bit more, I guess, kind of background learning. It's really good. So yeah, thank you for sticking with the podcast and listening all the way through. If you enjoyed, please consider liking or subscribing. And listen to some of the earlier episodes to get more of a feel for the sort of the audio quality in those ones. But yeah, if you would leave a nice review, give it 5 stars, drop it a follow, that'd be great. Or if you've got a story that you'd like to tell, if you think that you would be someone who's got tales to tell about how they ended up doing something, or even a subject that you're really passionate about that you want to talk about in a bit more detail, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to have you on the podcast, and I'd love to record some more episodes. So please get in touch. All the details of how to get in touch in the episode description. So yeah, thank you so much, and hopefully you'll be hearing again from me soon. Cheers.